Hello and welcome to the Unit 1 Section 1 video on 1 and 2 step equations. So now we're getting into the actual meat of the algebra course here, and we're going to be talking a little bit about solving for variables. So before we can solve for variables, we need to talk about what we're going to be doing, and that is an equation is a mathematical sentence with an equal sign. Okay, so up to this point we've been dealing with pretty much everything involving expressions, no equal sign involved. Okay, well now we're going to be talking about things that do include an equal sign. Okay, so the following are considered equations. 9 plus 2 equals 11, x plus 7 equals 37, a minus 3 equals 2a plus 5. All of these are equations because they contain an equal sign. Now, a solution to an equation is a value for a variable that makes the equation true. Okay, so a solution to an equation is a value for a variable that makes the equation true. So remember, a variable is just a placeholder. It's a letter that takes the place of a number that we don't know yet. And what we try to do to find the solution, we find what number equals that variable. Okay, so there are some rules for solving equations and finding out what those values are. When you solve an equation, your goal is to get the variable alone by itself. Okay, and typically we want to get that variable by itself on one side of the equal sign. Okay, in other words, we are trying to solve for the variable. When you are solving for a variable, you must use inverse operations to isolate the variable to one side of the equation. So in other words, when we're isolating a variable or solving for a variable, if we're moving something from one side of the equation to the other, if we're adding, say, plus 5 on one side, but we want to move it to the other, we have to subtract 5 from each side of the equation. Whatever you do to one side of the equation, you must do to the other side of the equation. No matter what you do to one side, you have to do the same thing to the other side to keep the equation balanced. Because if you do something to one side of the equation, well then therefore the equals doesn't hold anymore. We got to do the same thing to both sides. So let's talk a little bit about inverse operations. Adding and subtracting are inverse operations. So are multiplying and dividing. Okay. So let's state the inverse operation. If we're adding 23, the inverse is to subtract 23. If we're subtracting 18, the inverse is to add 18. If we're multiplying by negative 15, the inverse is to divide by negative 15. You note that if it's negative, we keep it negative. If it's positive, we keep it positive. All we're doing is stating what the inverse operation is. If we divide by 8, the inverse is to multiply by 8. When reading an equation, always start with a variable, then state what is happening to the variable. Then read the equal sign, then state what is on the opposite side of the equal sign. So let's do a few examples. All right, so for example 1, if I want to get m by itself, I got this plus 15 on this side. I need to move it to the left-hand side, so I'm going to subtract 15 from each side. And when I do that, that gives me negative 12 equals n. On this one, I've got 19 times p. To undo that one, I divide. Inverse operation. So I divide each side by 19, because remember, whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. And so we get p equals 3. Here, we've got to multiply each side by 13. So if we multiply this side by 13, and we multiply this side by 13, that's going to give us x on this side, and that's going to give us negative 52 on the right-hand side. For number 4, we're going to add 5 to each side to get x by itself. And when you do that, you get negative 10 equals x. For this one, we're going to multiply each side by 5. And so we get negative 45 equals k. For this one, we're subtracting 15, so we got to add it to both sides. That gets x by itself, and we have negative 4. For number 7, we have negative 9 minus a equals negative 21. So I'm going to add 9 to each side. Now we still have negative a on this side. On this side, we're going to end up with negative 12. Okay, now if negative a equals negative 12, then a has to equal 12. On this one, we're going to divide each side by negative 15. And that gives us 4 equals k. For this one, we add 11 to each side. And that's going to give us x equals negative 17. For this side, we're going to multiply each side by 6. 6 times 4 is 24. And that's equal to n. For this one, we divide each side by negative 3. And these are all one-step equations, because in every one, it takes one step to solve them. Here, we subtract 2, and we get n equals 12. All right, a few more here at the bottom. For this one, we're going to multiply each side by 15. 15 times negative 12 gives us negative 180, so that is our p. Here we're going to add 8 to each side. That gives us 18 equals x. For this one, we're going to subtract 17 from each side. And that's going to give us negative 11 equals n. For this one, we subtract 2 from each side. So r is going to equal negative 9. This one, we're going to divide each side by negative 17. And I think you pretty much get the gist of it at this point as to what we're doing to solve for our variable. And finally, x equals 6 for this last example. So that's one-step equations. Let's take it to two-step equations now. So in a two-step equation, we need to get the term with the variable by itself by moving the constant. Now remember, a constant is just a number with no variable attached to it. So in this case, we subtract 9 from each side. And that gives us 21 equals negative 7x. Then, from here, we need to solve for the variable as you would in the one-step equations that we just did. So we pick back up with 21 equals negative 7x. You're going to divide each side by negative 7, and you get that x equals negative 3. So let's do a few examples of this. So the first thing we're going to do with the first example is we're going to add 8 to each side to get the term with the variable by itself. And when you do that, you're going to get 4a equals negative 24. Then we divide each side by 4. And that gives us a equals negative 6. For this one, we're going to multiply each side by 3. That's going to give us x plus 9 equals 21. And then we're going to subtract 9 from each side. And that's going to give us x equals 12. For this one, we're going to subtract 5 from each side first, because that does not have the variable. So you get negative 2 equals m over 2. And then we're going to multiply each side by 2. And that's going to give us negative 4 equals m. For the next one, 8x minus 6 equals negative 62. We're going to add 6 to each side. And when we do that, we get 8x equals negative 56. And then we're going to divide each side by 8. And that's going to give us negative 7. That's our value for x. For this one, we subtract each side by 4. 40 equals negative 5r. And then we divide each side by negative 5. And that gives us negative 8 equals r. So in each case, we are trying to get the variable all by itself. So we start with the stuff that doesn't have the variable in it, such as here we're adding 1. That gives us negative 48. Then we divide each side by what number is attached to that variable. And that gives us n equals 8 for that one. For number 7 here, we are going to subtract 2 first. So we've got b over 9 equals 1. And then we multiply each side by 9. And so b equals 9. Here we're going to multiply each side by 7. That's going to give us 14 equals negative 3 plus x. And then we add 3 to each side. And that gives us 17 equals x. Add 10 to each side here. That gives you negative 4r equals negative 72. Divide each side by negative 4. And you get r equals 18. And then these last few examples. We add 8 to each side here. That gives you k over 3 equals negative 3. And then we multiply each side by 3. So k equals negative 9. Subtract 9 from each side on this one. You get negative 8k equals 137. Actually, no. Got to actually perform the operation. 137 minus 9 gives us 128. And now we're going to divide each side by negative 8. And that gives us k equals negative 16. And then finally, in this example, multiply each side by 2. That gives us negative 24 equals n minus 5. And we're going to add 5 to each side. So negative 24 plus 5 gives us negative 19. And that's our value for n. So here we've learned how to do 1- and 2-step equations, how to solve for a variable. In the next section, we are going to talk about solving multi-step equations. So these are equations that are going to take more than just 1 or 2 steps like the ones we have done here to introduce the topic.